Ms. Boy, step away from the counter, please.
Of course. What is this about? I am right in the middle of
The checks, Boy, the business accounts, the payments you took off the books.
was
Those
curious about
proceeds were handwritten, Ms. Boy. They're not in the system. They were never in the system.
Susan Boyer oversaw the finances of the North Battleford Post Office for nearly 5 years, and not one audit caught what she was doing. By the time investigators finally looked, $325 was gone.
If there's every accusation issue, it is something we can sit down and look at together, I'm sure.
She would not get the chance to explain at the counter. Within months, Canada Post Corporation Security and Investigation Services would pull 5 years of retail point-of-sale logs, reconcile them line by line against the business records of every commercial customer in North Battleford, and document 28 separate fraudulent transactions totaling $325,597. 28 checks, 5 years, one Canada Post employee, trusted with the deposit bag. The investigation that began as a quiet reconciliation discrepancy would end in a North Battleford provincial courtroom, with Judge David Kaiser handing down 28 months in federal custody. Quick question before we get into this one. How well do you actually know the person who handles the cash at your local post office, your local credit union, your neighborhood pharmacy? Think about it for a second. Drop your answer in the comments. And if you are new here, subscribe. We cover Canadian and American accountability cases every single week, and these stories do not get the coverage they deserve. Susan Boyer was born in the early 1960s in west central Saskatchewan, in the rural country surrounding North Battleford, a small prairie city sitting on the banks of the North Saskatchewan River, roughly 140 kilometers northwest of Saskatoon. Population just over 14,000. Grain elevators on the horizon. The kind of place where everyone uses everyone else's first name, where the rural mail run carries more than parcels, and where the post office is not just a building, but a piece of the civic spine. She grew up in a First Nations family with deep roots in the region. Her early years stretched across long prairie winters, summer trips out to family land, and the rhythm of a community where the local post office was the financial nerve center for hundreds of small businesses and thousands of households. The postmaster knew every customer, the mail carriers knew every dog, and the woman behind the counter knew who was waiting on which government check, which courier package, which registered letter from out east. By the time Susan finished her schooling, she had already absorbed the unspoken truth of small-town Saskatchewan life. Trust was the operating currency. A handshake at the counter meant more than any printed receipt. When she applied to Canada Post in the late 1990s, she was hired as a counter clerk at the North Battleford Post Office on the strength of references from people who had known her family for 2 generations. There was no national background screening unit poring over her records. There was a manager who had grown up 2 streets over, who shook her hand, and who told her to start the following Monday at 8 in the morning. Her starting wage was modest. Her first uniform was a navy polo with the Canada Post logo stitched over the heart. Her first till assignment was the front counter, weighing parcels, selling stamps, processing money orders for customers who had been buying their stamps from this exact storefront for 30 years. She learned the rhythm fast. The morning rush of small business owners dropping off bill payments, the midday lull, the after-school crowd of mothers picking up parcels, the 5 o'clock crush of office workers stopping in on their way home. She was good at the job. Her early performance evaluations described her as detail-oriented, dependable, and unusually patient with elderly customers who needed help filling out customs declarations or international parcel slips. One review noted that she had a calming presence at the counter during the December rush, when the lobby line wrapped past the P.O. boxes and out the front door. Another noted that she was consistent with deposit procedures and attentive to reconciliation. She married, she raised children, she buried her parents in the cemetery north of town. She bought a small bungalow on a quiet street, drove a used sedan to work every morning, and stayed late on the days when the rural carriers came back from their routes with bins of registered mail that needed processing before close. She coached a youth softball team for a couple of summers. She brought butter tarts to the staff Christmas potluck. She was, in every conceivable sense, the woman the community trusted at the counter. After several years on the counter, she was promoted into a role overseeing the financial aspects of the post office. Her new responsibilities included reconciling each day's till totals, supervising junior clerks on the cash drawer, preparing the daily bank deposit, and walking that deposit 2 blocks east on 100th Street to the bank branch. She had access to every till. She had access to the retail point of sale system, the RPOS, that recorded every transaction the post office processed. She had access to the locked drawer where business customer checks sat between the moment they arrived at the counter and the moment they were entered into the deposit ledger. She was, in the language of fraud investigators, a single point of failure. And no one at the North Battleford Post Office had any reason to believe she would ever become one. To understand what Susan Boyer did, you have to understand how Canada Post handled money at a small prairie facility in the early 2010s. Canada Post Corporation is a federal crown corporation. It operates under the Canada Post Corporation Act, and it carries a dual mandate. It must deliver mail across the second largest country on earth, and it must do so as a financially self-sustaining institution. Every dollar that flows through every counter in every post office from St. John's to Tofino is supposed to be captured, recorded, reconciled, and deposited into Canada Post's corporate accounts. The mechanism for capturing those dollars is the retail point of sale system, the RPOS. Every counter transaction, every stamp sold, every parcel weighed, every money order issued, every registered letter accepted, every bulk mailing paid for by a local business, all of it is supposed to be entered into the RPOS at the moment of the transaction. The RPOS generates a printed customer receipt. The RPOS records the transaction in a transaction log that is uploaded to Canada Post's central systems overnight. The RPOS forms the foundation of every reconciliation, every audit, every deposit slip, every monthly report at every branch in the country. At a major urban post office, the controls layered on top of the RPOS were extensive. There were multiple cashiers handling the same transaction stream. There were supervisors and managers and revenue protection officers and corporate security teams. There were random audits. There were customer service surveys that cross-referenced specific transactions. There were dollar flow benchmarks against branch foot traffic. At a small facility like North Battleford, those controls thinned out fast. There was one supervisor handling the deposit. There was one person preparing the reconciliation. There was one person carrying the cash and checks to the bank. And the local manager focused on the operational side of the post office, on staffing the routes and managing the carriers and chasing missing parcels, trusted the financial supervisor to do the financial supervisor's job. There was a structural assumption baked into the entire model. The assumption was that if a business customer paid Canada Post a substantial sum of money for a substantial volume of service, the business customer would expect that payment to be visible in their Canada Post account records. The assumption was that the customer's own bookkeeping would force a reconciliation. The assumption was that no one with access to the deposit bag would risk her career and her freedom on the bet that a business owner with 20,000 other things to track would simply not notice. The architecture of the scheme Susan Boyer would build over the next 5 years began with the realization that the assumption was wrong. The first fraudulent transaction occurred in January 2011. The Crown's sentencing submission did not identify the specific business customer involved, but the pattern of the scheme is documented in detail. A local North Battleford business, likely a small retailer or service provider with a regular customer mailing list, came into the post office to pay for a large volume mailing. The kind of mailing that goes out to several hundred or several thousand customers at a time. Statement runs, promotional flyers, annual notices. The kind of mailing that, in 2011, a small business still paid for with a check rather than a corporate credit card. The transaction would have totaled several $1,000s. The business owner or office manager would have handed a check across the counter to Susan Boyer. And Susan Boyer would have done what she had done 1,000 times before across her career. She would have accepted the check, calculated the postage on the volume, and produced a receipt. Except on this occasion, 3 things happened differently. First, She did not ring the transaction through the retail point of sale system. The check came in, the mailing went out. But the RPOS log for that afternoon contained no record that any business mailing payment had been received at all. As far as Canada Post's central systems were concerned, the transaction had never occurred. Second, she handed the customer a handwritten receipt, not a printed RPOS slip, a piece of paper, dated, with a dollar amount, with her initials. To the customer, it looked like documentation. The customer took the handwritten receipt back to the office, filed it in the accounting binder with every other paid invoice, and considered the transaction complete. The customer did not know that the handwritten receipt was unauthorized. The customer did not know that no parallel record of the transaction existed inside Canada Post's systems. Third, she did not put the check into the Canada Post deposit. She held on to it. Later, she deposited the check into an account under her own control. A check made payable to Canada Post somehow made it across the teller line into a personal account, and the mechanism by which that happened became part of the bank documentation Crown investigators would later subpoena. This was the architecture. 3 steps: RPOS concealment, handwritten receipt, check diversion. Each step addressed one component of the standard Canada Post financial controls model. The RPOS concealment eliminated the institutional record. The handwritten receipt satisfied the customer's expectation that a payment had been documented. The check diversion captured the funds. She did it 6 times in 2011. The total for that first year exceeded $68,000. Average transaction value, more than $11,000 per fraudulent diversion. She did it 8 times in 2012. $73,000 and change. She did it 5 times in 2013. $68,000. She did it 6 times in 2014. $69,000. She did it again in 2015, through the autumn months until the architecture finally cracked in November. By the time the scheme ended, Susan Boyer had executed 28 separate fraudulent transactions over a period of nearly 5 years. The total was $325,597. And during those 5 years, she had walked into the post office every morning at 8. She had said good morning to the carriers. She had logged into the RPOS terminal, recorded her own legitimate transactions, prepared the daily deposit, and walked the deposit bag 2 blocks east to the bank. Her colleagues had no reason to suspect anything. The customers had no reason to suspect anything. The handwritten receipts sat in 28 different accounting binders across 28 different North Battleford businesses, signed in her own handwriting, evidence of a system that none of them had ever heard described. She knew the checks were made payable to Canada Post. She knew the RPOS logs would never reflect the transactions. She knew the deposit bag would never carry those checks across 100th Street to the bank branch. And for nearly 5 years, no one inside or outside the post office assembled the picture. The available reporting on the Boyer case does not identify the specific moment of detection. What it identifies is the result. A Canada Post Corporation Security and Investigation Services file, opened in late 2015, focused on a reconciliation gap at the North Battleford facility. The investigation that closed Susan Boyer's career almost certainly began the way these investigations always begin, with a number that did not match another number. Inside Canada Post, every business customer above a certain volume threshold has an account. The account records every mailing. The account records every payment. The account records every reconciliation between the volume of mail tendered and the dollars received in exchange. For 5 years, there had been businesses in North Battleford writing checks for substantial bulk mailings that were not reflected in their Canada Post account records. For 5 years, the Canada Post deposit totals from the North Battleford facility had not matched the actual volume of business mailings processed through that facility. The gap had been quietly growing for years, hidden in the noise of normal branch fluctuation, until someone with the right vantage point finally noticed it. It is possible the investigation surfaced through a routine internal audit of branch reconciliation patterns. Audit cycles flag anomalies. a small facility processing high volumes of business mail with deposit totals lower than the volume would predict, is exactly the kind of anomaly that an experienced auditor learns to follow. It is possible the investigation surfaced through a customer complaint. A business owner doing year-end books, comparing the year's accounting binder against the actual postage spend in the general ledger. Noticing that an $11,000 payment to Canada Post appeared in their records, but did not appear on any Canada Post statement of account. Calling the post office, getting a confused response, calling again, eventually reaching someone in corporate billing who, looking at the account, would have said quietly, "We have no record of receiving that payment." It is possible the investigation surfaced through a tip from a coworker, someone who had noticed, over months or years, that the supervisor occasionally handed customers a handwritten receipt instead of an RPOS slip. Someone who had wondered why. Someone who had, after long hesitation, picked up a phone and called Canada Post Corporation Security and Investigation Services. What is documented is what came next. Investigators pulled the RPOS transaction logs for the North Battleford facility for the full 5-year period. They cross-referenced those logs against business customer records, against bank deposit records, against the Crown's own audit files. They built a transaction-by-transaction reconciliation, and out of that reconciliation, 28 separate fraudulent diversions emerged, each one tied to a specific customer payment, each one tied to a handwritten receipt rather than an RPOS slip, each one tied to a Canada Post check that had ended up in an account under Susan Boyer's control. The catalyst, whatever it was, had cracked the architecture. And the architecture, once cracked, came apart all the way back to January 2011. We are heading into the investigation now, and the part of this case that should make every business owner in Canada pause. If you appreciate accountability content like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We break down exactly how these schemes actually work every single week. And the next case on this channel goes even deeper. The Canada Post Corporation Security and Investigation Services Unit handles internal fraud cases involving Canada Post employees. It is staffed by trained corporate investigators with backgrounds in financial crime, audit, and law enforcement liaison. When the unit confirmed that the North Battleford reconciliation gap was the result of intentional employee fraud, the file moved into a documentation phase intended to support criminal prosecution under the Criminal Code of Canada. Investigators interviewed business customers. They asked each business to produce its accounting records for the conduct period. They asked each business to identify every payment it had ever made to Canada Post for bulk mailings. They asked each business to produce the receipts associated with each payment. The business records produced something extraordinary. Across the customer base, certain receipts were standard Canada Post retail point-of-sale slips, printed at the moment of transaction, formatted in the corporation's standard layout. Other receipts were handwritten, on scrap paper, with a dollar amount, a date, and initials. The handwritten receipts corresponded, transaction by transaction, to the missing entries in the Canada Post RPOS logs. The handwriting on each receipt was Susan Boyer's. Investigators pulled the bank records. They traced the checks. Each fraudulent transaction involved a check made payable to Canada Post that had been deposited into a personal account rather than a corporate account. The mechanism by which a check written to a Crown corporation made its way into a personal account is a question Crown investigators answered through bank documentation that became part of the evidentiary package. They built a transaction ledger, 28 rows. Each row contained a date, a business customer name, an amount, a handwritten receipt photograph, an RPOS gap reference, and a deposit trace endpoint. The ledger totaled $325,597. Average per transaction value, more than $11,000. The Crown brief built around the ledger described the architecture in 3 words that would later appear in the sentencing submission. An elaborate scheme, not opportunistic, not impulsive, not the kind of conduct a court could characterize as a single bad decision under economic pressure. Elaborate, methodical, sustained. 5 years of deliberate concealment touching every component of Canada Post's financial controls infrastructure. By the time the Crown laid charges, Susan Boyer had retained defense counsel. Her lawyer was Ivan Frank, a Saskatchewan defense practitioner with experience in Crown Corporation fraud cases. He met with his client, reviewed the brief, and began the work that any experienced defense counsel does in a case of this scope. He looked for procedural defects in the investigation. He looked for evidentiary gaps in the transaction ledger. He looked for sentencing mitigation. He found one mitigating factor that would matter at sentencing. Before any plea, before any conviction, Susan Boyer had voluntarily repaid approximately $130,000 of the loss, roughly 40% of the total. Under Canadian sentencing principles, voluntary pre-sentencing restitution is one of the strongest mitigating factors a defense counsel can place on the scale, because it speaks to remorse and to acceptance of responsibility in a way that no statement of allocution ever can. He also raised the Gladue principle. Under Section 718, 2E of the Criminal Code, a sentencing court is required to consider the unique systemic and background factors of Indigenous offenders. Susan Boyer is a First Nations woman. The Gladue framework, derived from the 1999 Supreme Court of Canada decision in R.V.'s Gladue, requires the court to consider whether sanctions other than imprisonment may be appropriate, and to consider the cultural and community context in which the offense occurred. In a federal sentence case, the Gladue principle also opens the door to a request that the sentence be served at a culturally appropriate Indigenous correctional facility. That request would come at sentencing. The facility named in the request was Okemaw-Ochi Healing Lodge in Maple Creek, Saskatchewan. The available record does not describe the moment of arrest in operational detail. What it describes is what followed. A charge was sworn under Criminal Code Section 380(1)(a), fraud over $5,000. The matter proceeded through the Saskatchewan provincial court system on a path toward resolution rather than trial. Susan Boyer did not contest the conduct. Through counsel, she accepted responsibility for the 28 transactions. The case turned not on whether the fraud had occurred, but on what sentence would be imposed. The sentencing hearing was held on January 8, 2018, in North Battleford Provincial Court before Judge David Kaiser. The Crown's sentencing submission described the conduct in the terms the investigation had documented: an elaborate scheme, 5 years in duration, 28 fraudulent transactions, $325,597 in total loss, a breach of trust by an employee in a position of financial responsibility at a Crown corporation. The Crown sought a federal sentence, that is, a sentence of 2 years or more, which under Canadian law removes an offender from the provincial correctional system and places them in the Federal Correctional Service of Canada system. The Crown's position was that the duration of the scheme, the methodical concealment architecture, the total quantum of loss, and the breach of trust dimension all required a sentence at the higher end of the range for fraud over $5,000 by an employee in a position of trust. Defense counsel Ivan Frank presented the mitigating factors: the $130,000 in voluntary pre-sentencing restitution, the acceptance of responsibility through resolution rather than trial, the absence of a prior criminal record, the Gladue factors, and the systemic background considerations applicable to a First Nations offender under Section 718. 2E, and the request that, if a federal sentence were imposed, Susan Boyer be permitted to serve that sentence at the Okemaw-Ochi Healing Lodge, the minimum and medium security federal facility for Indigenous women operated by the Correctional Service of Canada at Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, established under Section 81 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. The courtroom was small. The gallery contained members of Susan Boyer's family. It contained representatives of Canada Post. It contained the kind of muted, expectant silence that fills any provincial courtroom at the moment a person is about to learn how much of their life they will spend in custody. Judge Kaiser took the sentencing under reserve for portions of the morning and returned to deliver his decision in the afternoon. The sentence was 28 months federal custody, 2 years and 4 months, sufficient to place Susan Boyer in the federal correctional system rather than the provincial system. aligned in the symmetry of the case with the 28 fraudulent transactions she had executed across 5 years. Judge Kaiser ordered full restitution in the amount of $325,597. With the $130,000 already repaid, the outstanding restitution obligation stood at roughly $195,000. The court imposed a victims of crime surcharge of $200. No probation order was attached, which is standard in Canadian sentencing practice for federal custody dispositions, where the offender will be subject to statutory release supervision through the Correctional Service of Canada rather than to provincial probation. On the request that Susan Boyer be permitted to serve her sentence at Okimau-Ochi Healing Lodge, Judge Kaiser made no order. The determination of institutional placement within the federal correctional system rests with the Correctional Service of Canada, not with the sentencing court. The court could note the request. The court could acknowledge the GLADU factors that supported it, but the placement itself would be assessed by federal corrections according to the security classification matrix, the offender's needs assessment, and the operational reality of the receiving institution. Okimau-Ochi Healing Lodge sits on Nekaneet First Nation land in the Cypress Hills of southwest Saskatchewan, approximately 400 kilometers south of North Battleford. The facility, opened in 1995, is operated under Section 81 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, which permits the federal correctional system to enter into agreements with Indigenous communities for the care and custody of Indigenous offenders. It houses up to 60 federal women offenders. It is built around a circular lodge design rather than a traditional cell block layout. It integrates Indigenous cultural and spiritual programming into the daily routine. For an Indigenous woman serving a federal sentence in Saskatchewan, Okimau-Ochi is the placement that aligns with the GLADU framework's recognition that culturally appropriate corrections is not a luxury, but a statutory expectation. For Canada Post, the case became a documented example of the structural vulnerability of small postal facilities to long-duration multi-step concealment schemes. Internal financial controls reviews following the Boyer case examined the layering of supervisory roles at small facilities, the reconciliation cadence for business customer check payments, and the audit triggers that should activate when a small facility's deposit totals diverge from its documented mail volume. The corporation does not publicly disclose the specific control changes it made. The fact that the changes were made is consistent with how every Crown corporation responds to a 5-year, $300,000 internal fraud conviction. The handwritten receipts, 28 of them across 28 North Battleford businesses, remained in the Crown's evidentiary file. The RPOS gap remained in Canada Post's internal records. The check trace documentation remained in the bank's archived records. The transaction ledger that had taken months to build now sat as a permanent record of how a single employee, trusted with the deposit bag at a small prairie post office, had executed an elaborate scheme across 5 years against a Crown corporation that had hired her on the strength of a handshake and a manager who had grown up 2 streets over. Susan Boyer served her sentence. The Correctional Service of Canada made its placement determination through its own processes. She would be released under statutory release provisions before the full 28 months had elapsed. The restitution order would follow her. The conviction would follow her. The handwritten receipts would follow her in a way that no judgment ever quite captures. 28 pieces of paper in 28 accounting binders in 28 North Battleford businesses, each one a small, permanent record of the 5 years she had spent betraying the people who had trusted her at the counter. This case was quiet and methodical and devastating in a way only a small-town Crown corporation fraud can be. But the case on your screen right now goes somewhere worse.